Hi, this is TJR, and right now I'm holding up a copy of the 2009 remaster of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. And I'd like to ask you a question. What is this album worth? You know, when I bought it, I paid $9.99 at Target. And in fact, when these 2009 remasters were released, they had a special deal. If you bought any two, you got a $5 Target gift card. So I guess that was a $2.50 rebate that I got on this album. So let's see here. $9.99 plus a $2.50 rebate, that's $7.49. So is the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album worth $7.49? You know, watching the movie Big Eyes, which I reviewed here on the channel earlier, with its story about highbrow art versus lowbrow art, commercial art versus fine art, and the mass production of art, has gotten me thinking a lot about how we value art and also how we define it. And in the movie, we have an art critic played by the actor Terence Stamp, who in print crushes and dismisses the art of Keane because he feels that he has a duty to guide people to what real art is. He remarks that just because a lot of people like this doesn't necessarily qualify it as art. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Beatles were pretty damn popular and are pretty damn popular even now. Does that popularity, and by popularity I mean that acceptance by, the majority of people, therefore validate them as art? If they weren't popular, would their music still be art? Does the amount of units they've sold validate them as art? Now, there's a movie called The Thomas Crown Affair, which stars Pierce Brosnan and Rene Russo, and it's an art heist movie. And there's a scene early on in the film where a school field trip of young children are being shown around the museum. And there's a museum tour guide that is showing these kids around and explaining to them the cultural and historical significance of a very prominent painting that's in the museum. And she's trying to communicate this painting as a work of art to these kids. And these kids are bored. They don't care. Finally, the tour guide just gives up and says, all right, it's worth, and then you fill in the blank, $20 million, some huge amount. But she says to them, it's worth $20 million. And all these kids, suddenly their eyes light up and they all go, ooh, because it's worth a lot of money. And now, granted, these are kids, but I think that a lot of adults respond the same way. Partly because it's learned behavior, but also because the general attitude for a lot of people is, it has to be great art, honey, or it wouldn't be worth a lot of money. I remember once reading an interview with a comedian and actor, Steve Martin, who is a big art collector from what I hear. He was being asked, what makes a painting worth, once again, fill in the blank, $50,000. And his response was, well, what makes a painting worth $50,000 is the fact that someone's willing to pay that much for it. Now, as we all know, Vincent van Gogh died unrecognized for his work. Of course, now his paintings are worth untold millions, and art scholars the world over sing his praises, call him one of the most important artists of the 20th century. But in his day, he died unrecognized and penniless. Now, do we respond to the art of Vincent van Gogh today because he is famous? Do we respond to his art because his paintings are worth so much money? Or do we respond to his art because we really do love it? I would tend to think that there are some of us who respond for any number of these reasons, and maybe a combination of all three. So, does monetary value validate art? Now, growing up as a kid back in the 70s, I got very much into comic books, and this is a comic book from that time period that I owned as a kid. And I remember I looked into this book here, and I looked at the artwork, and I remember I was just blown away by the artwork in this comic book here. And I took note of the artist's name. His name was Neal Adams. And I thought, wow, this guy's really good. What I experienced as a kid looking into these pages was art to me, even if my teacher said it wasn't. Now, back in the 70s, comic book art was probably lower on the totem pole than even lowbrow art. And in fact, so low on the totem pole that I'm willing to bet that if you were a comic book artist back then and people asked you, hey, what do you do for a living? You would have probably said, I'm a commercial artist. And of course, even to this day, to a certain extent, if we call art commercial art, we suddenly stop thinking of it as art. And for that reason, then, wouldn't we call the Beatles commercial art? Or do we call it art? And I remember a conversation I had with one of my adult nephews a few years back. And he was looking at artwork by some of the great masters. And he then was looking at some of art, some modern art that he thought was ridiculous. And he said, don't we have great artists anymore? I said, sure we do. They work in film. They do production art. They work in comic books doing graphic novels. They work in all manner of commercial, what we call commercial artwork. But that doesn't mean it's not great art. In fact, most of the great masters who we now hang in museums, like Leonardo da Vinci, for all intent and purposes, were commercial artists. Patrons paid them, for the most part, to produce what we now call their masterpieces. So once again, how do we define art? Do we define it because it hangs in a museum? Do we define it because it's worth a lot of money? Do we define it because the majority of people like it? This led me to remember a conversation I had several years ago. In fact, during like the late 90s or so, early thousands, with a fellow musician. And he and I were at a restaurant somewhere sharing some dinner. We were in a band together. And for whatever reason, I began to talk about a comic book series that I was reading at the time. And I had it, in fact, I think I had the graphic novel with me, and I was talking about it and showing it to him. And he was looking it over, thumbing through the pages. And he said to me, so how much is this worth? And of course, this was referring to the fact that most people were kind of vaguely familiar with the fact that old comic books were worth money. And of course, this was during a time period, late 90s, early thousands, when there was this huge speculators market boom going on. And people were buying comic books who weren't even interested in them because they thought they were going to be an investment. They thought they were going to be worth money. And I said to him, the fact that comic books are worth money, worth like investment money, has totally, or I should say, was probably one of the worst things that has ever happened to the art form of comics. And he said, what do you mean? And I said to him, well, you've got a collection of DVDs that you like, right? And he said, yeah, because he did have a large movie collection that he really enjoyed and prized. I said, what are your movies worth? And he looked at me kind of strange, like, what do you mean? What are they worth? What are they worth? Those movies. I mean, are they worth more than what you paid for them? What are they worth? It's like, no, they're I bought them, I guess they're worth whatever I paid for them. And I said to him, those movies you have are worth the enjoyment that you get every time you experience them. And I said, these comic books that I have, I don't consider what their monetary investment value might be. They are worth the enjoyment that I get from experiencing the story and looking at the artwork. that's what they're worth. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that art is not defined by a small group of critics who say, this is worthy, this is not worthy. Art is not defined by a majority consensus. Art is not defined as art because it hangs in a museum. Art is not defined as art because of its monetary worth. At the end of the day, art is defined by no one but you and you alone. It is defined by the satisfaction you receive when you experience it, whether it takes the form of a painting or a sculpture or a motion picture or a play or a novel or a comic book. Art is defined by you. Hey, this is TJR, and hope you liked that video, and I'll be curious to know your thoughts on this subject. So I'm looking forward to reading your comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.